The updated version of the document proposes that aggression against Russia by any non-nuclear weapon state, but with the participation or support of a nuclear weapon state, should be regarded as a joint attack on the Russian Federation. The conditions for Russia's transition to the use of nuclear weapons are also clearly defined. We will consider such a possibility as soon as we receive reliable information about a massive launch of aerospace attack means and their crossing of our state border, meaning strategic or tactical aircraft, cruise missiles, drones, hypersonic missiles, and other aircraft.
The Ukraine war has just entered into a really scary phase. Vladimir Putin is threatening a possible nuclear attack. Recently, he changed Russia's rules for nuclear weapons in quite a big and alarming way. Putin said that from now on, attacks into Russia by a non-nuclear state aided by a nuclear state would be considered as a joint attack. Also, the president claimed that a massive launch of missiles, aircraft, and drones would lead Russia to consider using nuclear weapons if there's a critical threat to its sovereignty. As we'll cover later in the video, this all has to do with new fighter jets and long-range capabilities that Ukraine has received from NATO. These things present a real threat to Russia in the war. Now, personally, when I hear things about nuclear weapons, I get really worried, and I'm probably not the only one. But that might be the exact point. Putin could be saying this stuff as a form of nuclear blackmail, using his nuclear capabilities as some sort of psychological warfare. Before we dive into the video though, I'd like to ask for something first. We can't make these videos without your support, and the best thing you can do to help the channel is to hit the like button below. This helps us a ton in the algorithm. With that out of the way, let's get into the basics. First of all, we should cover these nuclear threats in detail. Basically, Putin wants to draw some sort of a red line, specifically against the West. Russia used to have a no first use doctrine on nuclear weapons, where the use of nukes is only allowed during an attack that threatens the existence of the Russian state. Exact guidelines on this were published by Putin back in 2020. Now, it's up for interpretation when the existence of the Russian state is exactly at risk. Putin could use this very loosely and say that Russia is already at peril because of the Ukraine incursion into Kursk and repeated drone attacks on its cities. Still, saying that there are existential risks to the whole country is probably a bridge too far, even for Putin. Also, he started this war, so he would rather downplay the damage Ukraine's doing to Russia as it would show weakness on his side. However, what's really concerning is that Russia's considering changing its nuclear policy document. The change would add more scenarios in which nukes might be used. If an unspecified amount of missiles, aircraft, or drones threatens Russian territory, it could be enough for a nuclear retaliation. Of course, this relates to the massive Ukrainian attacks into Russia to destroy military targets. But importantly, the changes could allow Russia to strike the partners of Ukraine. This new joint attack principle is completely new to Russia's nuclear policy. Indirectly, it's saying that nuclear powers helping Ukraine with attacks on Russia could expect a nuclear response. The Kremlin is saying that this should be considered a definite signal. Basically, if the West goes too far in its support, Putin claims he's willing to start a nuclear war. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said that these threats are totally irresponsible during an MSNBC interview. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg agreed with this, saying that Russia's nuclear rhetoric is dangerous and reckless. At the same time the Russian government's normalizing nuclear threats, similar things are happening in Russian state media. A Russian journalist and Nobel Peace Prize winner named Dmitry Muratov warned that Russian propaganda is preparing people to think that nuclear war is not a bad thing. On TV channels here, nuclear war and nuclear weapons are promoted as if they're advertising pet food. For example, state TV aired a threat from a Russian lawmaker calling for nuclear strikes on Britain and Germany. The lawmaker said that if we turn the British Isles into a Martian desert in 3 minutes flat using tactical nuclear weapons, not strategic ones, they could use Article 5. But for whom? A non-existent country turned into a Martian desert? They won't respond. He made similar comments about Germany, saying that Germans should understand that if there's a strike against the decision-making centers, the main decision-making center is Berlin. Keep in mind that he's saying this stuff on Russia 1, one of the largest TV channels in the country. A reporter on the same channel said that if NATO sends troops to Ukraine, Russia would actually hit decision-making centers in the US, disarm France in an instant, and make the British Isles go underwater. And the list of influential figures calling for a nuclear war just keeps on going. A Russian political scientist said that we'll have to hit a bunch of targets in a number of countries in order to bring those who have lost their mind to reason. Now, I can't help but find this ironic, because talking about nuclear strikes seems like the most unreasonable thing to say. Ukraine, together with a bunch of its supporters, don't really believe Russia's threat though. They see it as a massive bluff, designed to give Russia some strategic advantage. Zelensky's chief of staff said that Russia no longer has anything other than nuclear blackmail to intimidate the world. Putin claims he's willing to start World War III if he doesn't get his way in Ukraine. But if we look at the history of the conflict, we can say two things about Putin's nuclear threats. They did slow down NATO's support of Ukraine, but in the end, Russia's threats and red lines have proven to be groundless. In the first days of the war, Putin ordered his nuclear forces to go into a special mode of combat duty, which was an implicit threat. He said that if foreign countries intervene in the war, it would lead to consequences they have never seen. All over the world, people were freaking out about a potential further escalation of the conflict. Governments in Europe and America wanted to help Ukraine, but they had a hard time judging how serious Putin was. Later, the Russian president would continue to make implicit nuclear threats against NATO. He said that if anyone sets out to intervene in the current events from the outside and creates unacceptable threats for us that are strategic in nature, they should know that our response will be lightning fast. We have all the tools for this that no one else can boast of having. We won't boast about it. We'll use them if needed, and I want everyone to know that. These threats are purposefully left vague because they have one goal in mind: to make Ukraine's allies afraid. To keep this nuclear blackmail alive, Putin had to move further and further with his threats. In September 2022, the Russian dictator said that he would defend his 4 annexed regions in Ukraine with all means at our disposal, adding that this is not a bluff. He didn't rule out the use of nuclear weapons to defend these territories that he now views as part of the Russian Federation. To some extent, this has worked. There have been long delays in NATO's aid to Ukraine, and some of it has to do with the uncertainty of Russia's reaction to it. The new weapons that we'll talk about later could have been sent much earlier if NATO was more assertive. But because it's such a high-stakes situation, Western leaders can't afford to make any miscalculations. Also, Putin knows that he can scare the voters in Western democracies, so the political support for Ukraine gets undermined if the situation gets too scary. But analysts are pointing out that there's one thing limiting Putin's nuclear blackmail. He'll have to keep escalating his rhetoric to keep the fear of Armageddon alive. But at some point, it'll simply stop working. In a way, it works just like a game of poker. If you raise the stakes every single time, people will call your bluff and challenge you. Perhaps the ultimate show of Russia's red lines being worth nothing was the Kursk incursion. With Ukrainian troops inside Russia, Putin had the basis for a nuclear attack according to his own rules. He's repeatedly said that he would use all the means at our disposal in order to defend Russia's own territory. But apparently that's not the case. Also, if you look at it from a game theory perspective, most of the threats the country's making are unrealistic and, to be honest, incredibly stupid. Now, before we get into that, I quickly wanted to answer a question I recently got asked. A lot of you guys want to start a YouTube channel, but you're camera shy or just not comfortable putting your face out there. In fact, I'm one of those people, and that's why this channel has no face on it. Luckily, you can still grow on YouTube even without showing your face or giving up your privacy. This channel's the living proof of that. In fact, here are just a few examples of channels that started in the last 12 months and grew an audience without showing their face. They've gotten millions of views and made thousands of dollars from them. We recently crossed 1 million subscribers, and along the way, we've learned a few tips and tricks about YouTube that can be very helpful to any of you who want to start your channel. We've included all this in my completely free 7-day YouTube Crash Bootcamp. So if you're someone who's interested in starting a YouTube channel, this is the perfect starting point for you. What better way to convince you than to read a comment left by a previous student? This free bootcamp's better than a paid course he took. So if you're interested in signing up, you can sign up now for free by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on screen. In the Russian state media, they're talking all about how Russia could destroy Western capitals with its nuclear weapons. For example, they covered how a nuclear bomb on London would look like, and that it would cost 850,000 casualties. Also, Putin said that Europe doesn't have an early warning system, claiming that they're more or less defenseless against tactical nukes. But if the Russian president and state media talk about this stuff, they might as well cover how nuclear bombs on Moscow, St. Petersburg, and all the other Russian cities would look. Everyone knows there's no way back with nuclear bombs, and that a nuclear exchange kills everybody. The United States has many nukes stationed in Europe, and the United Kingdom, together with France, also have their own. Combined, they're more than enough to destroy Russia. Let's just pray that they'll never get used. The only reasonable explanation for the change in nuclear policy is this: it's not a real threat to NATO, but more a sign that Putin's feeling cornered. It coincides with new Western weapons going to Ukraine that have the potential to deliver a blow to Russia itself. To be more specific, it has to do with the F-16 deliveries, and talk about allowing Western cruise and ballistic missiles to hit military targets inside Russia. Ukraine's been fighting with one hand tied behind its back, as it isn't yet allowed to strike logistics centers and military bases across the border. Also, it lacked a competitive air force, which causes severe problems with air defense and frontline support. The dozens of promised F-16s have the potential to change that. On their own, these things won't win Ukraine the war, but they will make the conflict a lot harder and more costly for Russia. We only have to look at the Kremlin's dramatic reaction to understand how effective these things might be. At first glance, it seems that Putin's nuclear blackmail is working. For months now, the US has been doubting whether it should allow strikes into Russia with the ATAC-MS system, despite repeated calls to do so from Kiev. The main reason is, of course, Russia's response, which is hard to predict. The Kremlin has stated that if Western-supplied missiles hit inside Russia, it would be at war with NATO. But officials from the US and NATO are already calling bluff on this, so they might allow limited strikes on several designated targets. Even though the nuclear threats are more about nuclear blackmail than actual red lines, the world is obviously still better off without them. That's because Putin is playing with fire. If his war fails, Putin might feel cornered politically and start to do some crazy things. This probably won't involve a nuclear attack on NATO, as it's a suicidal move. We have to keep in mind that Putin can't launch nukes on his own. In Russia, there's a layered chain of command that decides whether they'll launch a nuke. There's multiple levels where Russian officials can simply refuse to start a nuclear war. If these officials love their family and friends, they'll probably refuse to cooperate with Putin. A much more realistic but still incredibly dangerous development is a small-scale tactical nuke on Ukraine. Although nuclear bombs are nuclear bombs, there are great differences between several variants. The biggest nuclear bomb ever detonated was the Soviet Tsar Bomba, with an estimated yield of 50 megatons of TNT. That is the power to destroy the biggest cities in the world. For comparison, the Tsar Bomba was thousands of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They had estimated yields of 15 and 22 kilotons of TNT respectively. Right now, Russia doesn't have bombs as powerful as the Tsar Bomba. Recently, tests of the country's most advanced nuclear missile failed. But it's also worth looking at the very smallest nuclear weapons, called tactical nuclear weapons. They aren't as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb, but way more powerful than regular bombs. The yields can be as small as 1 kiloton or less, meaning small relative to other nukes. They can't destroy cities like strategic nuclear bombs, but they can in fact obliterate entire chunks of the enemy front lines. The tactical nuclear weapons can be launched with missiles from the ground, air, and sea like their bigger counterparts. But because of their smaller size, there are many other possibilities for how to use them. For example, tactical nukes can be delivered with a cannon as a form of artillery. It'll look something like this. It still has a regular mushroom cloud shape, but the scale is much more practical for frontline use. You could even technically use these bombs as landmines. Importantly, these small-scale nuclear weapons won't draw much attention, as they don't look that different from regular ammunition before they detonate. On top of that, there aren't any arms control agreements on tactical nukes, so they're much more in a gray area. The nuclear fallout with smaller nukes is also limited, so they won't permanently damage entire regions. All of this to say that if Putin goes nuclear, he'll likely start off with his tactical nukes. Russia has about 1,500 of them, according to the Federation of American Scientists, although that's just one estimate. Russia has no obligation to publish exact figures on tactical nukes, so nobody really knows how many it has. We do know that Russia sent part of its nuclear tactical arsenal to Belarus to form a threat from the 673-mile or 1,084-kilometer border north of Ukraine. They're doing joint drills to simulate using nuclear weapons in combat. In a way, this possibility of Putin using tactical nukes in Ukraine is very scary. But the use of nuclear weapons is nothing you want to normalize, no matter how small they are. That's one of the reasons why both Russia and the United States withdrew most of their tactical nuclear weapons after the Cold War. If Putin is crazy enough to break this convention, though, the conflict in Ukraine and the world by and large will enter into a new phase. Just about everyone in the world doesn't want nuclear weapons to be used again, which is the main reason why Putin hasn't used tactical nukes thus far in the conflict. Even China and India, who have a fairly neutral stance on the conflict, don't want Russia to use nukes of any kind. And the United States already has a plan on how to react to a tactical nuke being used in Ukraine, so it will probably only make the war worse for Putin himself. We have to keep in mind that whatever Putin is saying is psychological warfare more than anything. Threatening with nuclear weapons is really his last resort in a war where he's struggling to make progress. The talk about nuclear attacks on NATO can only be seen as nuclear blackmail, because it would mean the end of the world as we know it. The use of tactical nukes on the front lines is slightly more realistic, but it's still an incredibly risky move for Putin. The international condemnation that would follow would be nothing like we've ever seen. In the end, only time will tell how this plays out. If you have any other interesting perspective on this, please leave a comment down below. With that out of the way, thanks for watching.